Good morning. Here we are again to finish off our first quarter of the course in Texas history. When we met last time, we talked about the lead up to the Battle of San Jacinto, the last and again most pivotal battle in the Texas Revolution, April the 21st, 1836. We acknowledge that on the night of April the 20th, as both Houston's army and Santa Anna's were on the same battlefield, i.e. the plain at San Jacinto, and encamped in their respective positions, that Prefecto Cas arrived with 542 additional soldiers to add to Ramirez y Sesma's Mexican troops of approximately 1,000. So that brought the total to just under 1,550 Mexican troops. But the Mexican troops under Cas, who had just arrived to join Santa Anna and Ramirez y Sesma's troops, were tired after a long journey through the Brazos River Valley bottom. I grew up along the Gulf Coast in Richmond and Rosenberg, and the Brazos River bottom is covered with snakes and spiny thorns and cactuses and alligators, and it is not a pleasant place to travel if you were 500 or 900 soldiers, etc., as the Mexican army had before San Jacinto. But because the Prefecto Cas's troops were tired, Santa Anna's forces remained encamped with Mexican sentries guarding the approaches of the camp. And on the following day, April the 21st, Houston intended to strike Santa Anna early in the morning, but the actual battle and attack didn't start until 3:30 in the afternoon. The Texans advanced, and they got within 100 yards of the outer perimeter of the Mexican camp before Mexican sentries opened fire. Now, I don't know about you, but I think it's 9.5 seconds is the world record, 100 meters record. But if the Texans were within 100 yards of the outer perimeter of the Mexican camp, I bet you I could set a world record headed in the opposite direction, but just joking about that. But the truth is, if you think about it, it didn't take long before the advancing Texans had overwhelmed the sentries at the exterior of the Mexican camp and then broke into the camp itself. I tell you that because within 15 minutes, practically speaking, 15 minutes, the Battle of San Jacinto was over, with huge numbers of Mexican troops fleeing the battlefield, including Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. The actual battle ended within 15 minutes, but the killing by Texans of Mexican troops went on until the sun went down at probably 6:30 or 7 o'clock in April of 1836. Many Mexican soldiers were shot in the back or stabbed in the back as they fled the battlefield. Many of them were killed, surrendering with their hands over their head, crying out in pidgin English, "Mino Goliad, Mino Alamo." It didn't matter. Vengeful Texans, many of them who had lost relatives at the Alamo and at Goliad, simply killed until they were tired of killing. When even prominent officers like General Castilleron, who was in charge of the camp guard and the sentries, attempted to surrender, Castilleron was struck down and killed, murdered, as he offered his sword to a young Texas soldier. The Texans were in a vengeful mood. In fact, it's estimated that 630 Mexicans were killed, 208 wounded, and 730 captured, for a total of 1,568. So that probably was the entire Mexican army. The Texans only had 9 killed and 34 wounded, for a total casualty of 43, but of the 34 wounded, one was Sam Houston, who was hit in the ankle as he rode his horse toward the Mexican camp, and his ankle was shattered by a Mexican musket ball. Santa Anna managed to flee the battlefield, and if the entire camp was overrun and the battle effectively ended in 15 minutes, one has to question, how did the general, history records that the following day Santa Anna was discovered wearing a private's uniform that he had changed into in a cane brake, hiding well away from the battlefield, about a mile away from the battlefield. After his captor had made sure that he didn't have any weapons on him, the Texans who took Santa Anna captive put him on the back of a horse and rode back into camp. And as soon as the Texan and his captive arrived at camp, some of the 730 Mexican soldiers who were taken prisoner immediately began to cry out, "El Presidente, El Presidente!" And the captive Mexican had no alternative but to admit that indeed he was Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. The question is, how was Santa Anna so successful in fleeing the battlefield within 15 minutes? And it's almost impossible to think that General Santa Anna was in his camp, in his tent, dressed in his heavy general's uniform, heard the firing as Texans were within 100 yards of the outer perimeter of his camp, looked out of his tent and began to see soldiers falling by random fire, and the general said, "Oh my God, all is lost," to himself, probably said, "Oh my God, all is lost, and I've got to get out of here and flee the battlefield. I can't afford to be captured by the Texans," and immediately ran over and pulled the pants off of a dead Mexican private body and changed clothes very quickly, and then managed to flee the battlefield even as the Texans were advancing, even when the entire battle was 15 minutes long. And that's almost impossible. And that is where the story of the Yellow Rose of Texas comes into play. The Yellow Rose of Texas, the song, "The Yellow Rose of Texas, the only girl for me, her eyes sparkle like diamonds." You can sing of Rosalie, you can sing, Clementine, you can sing of Rosalie, but the Yellow Rose of Texas is the only girl for me. In fact, the Yellow Rose of Texas was Emily Morgan. Emily Morgan was a mulatto, mixed race lady that Santa Anna had discovered while during the siege at the Alamo. And in fact, she had joined the general as his mistress in traveling with Ramirez y Sesma's army. And a much more plausible explanation, and one that probably isn't shared with 7th graders in the state of Texas in 7th grade history, is that Santa Anna was at siesta in his tent with Emily at the time of the attack at 3:30 in the afternoon. Chances are very good that the general was not fully clothed, if you get my drift, spending time with Emily. So he probably wasn't in that heavy general's uniform. When he heard firing, he immediately jumped out of his cot, ran over to the tent flap, opened it, and saw soldiers falling, and it was much easier then for General Santa Anna to run outside, grab a dead private, pull his pants and shirt and shoes off, and immediately flee the battlefield. That is a much more plausible explanation of how Santa Anna got away from the Texans within 15 minutes of the entire battle of San Jacinto being over. But when Santa Anna was finally captured, and when he rode back into camp, and the Mexican prisoners began to cry out, "El Presidente, El Presidente," he had to acknowledge who he was, but the reality is that he was very much so afraid for his life, because immediately many Texas troops said, we have that blankety blank. We need to kill him. We need to shoot him. You know, we need to do the same thing that he did to Fannin and the Alamo defenders, etc. And a very, very concerned and afraid for his life, Santa Anna was brought before Sam Houston, the commander, the victorious commander of the Texas troops. Houston, who had had his ankle completely shattered, was sitting leaned up against a great big oak tree. Doctors had given him cocaine to literally zonk him out of his mind because of the extreme pain. His ankle was so badly shattered that after the Battle of San Jacinto, Houston had to go to New Orleans, where American doctors performed very delicate surgery, picking bone and fragments of the musket ball out of his ankle. And Houston would limp and suffer from that wound literally for the rest of his life. It was a terrible, terrible wound. So Houston was zonked out of his mind on painkillers, and Santa Anna was so concerned and so distressed and began to visibly shake that Texas doctors realized that he was emotionally distraught, and so they gave him some cocaine, and then the two leaders of the two armies sat down and made peace. They don't tell you that in 7th grade, and it's not a popular thing to share with 7th graders. But both Houston and Santa Anna were in a drug-induced state when they agreed to peace on the battlefield of San Jacinto. Santa Anna immediately agreed that he would meet with David G. Burnett, and within a week, I believe it was within a week, that he had by presidential ordered all remaining Mexican troops to take their arms and march south of the Rio Grande River. And he later would disavow what he had done. He claimed that that was just a holding tactic, and that he was really biding his time, expecting the Mexican army to come and rescue him. And when they didn't, he was mortally offended. He also agreed to a cessation of all hostilities, and and he also agreed with David G. Burnett that if the Texans would let him go, that he would return to Mexico to use an influence on the Mexican nation to accept a public treaty that would establish the independence of Texas with the Rio Grande as its boundary. The truth is that many in Texas, many Texans, desired his death, but Houston and David G. Burnett both recognized the validity of his using Santa Anna. From the battlefield of San Jacinto, Houston sent a message, three messengers, to Washington, D.C., informing his old boss and mentor, President Andrew Jackson of the United States of America, that Texas was, as far as Houston was concerned, independent, having gained its independence at San Jacinto, and that Texans desired to be annexed into the United States. That would not happen. Andrew Jackson would reluctantly recognize Texas on the last day of his administration in December, or January, actually technically February, I'll get it right here in a minute, February 1837, because the new president would be sworn in 1800, on March the 4th of 1837. So on the last day of the Andrew Jackson administration, he recognized the Republic of Texas, but he couldn't go to Congress and ask that Congress annex Texas, because Texas was a slave state, or would have entered the Union as a slave state, and the abolitionists in the American North did not want to tip the balance of power between the pro and anti-slavery senators in the United States Senate, and the acquisition of Texas as a slave state would have added two more slave supporters to the United States Senate. And so the North wasn't going to tolerate the annexation of Texas, and Jackson understood that. So Texas would not be annexed. But on June the 4th of 1836, Santa Anna and his secretary, Ramon Cairo, and his colonel, his aide, Colonel Almonte, were placed aboard the schooner Invincible, and the Invincible prepared to sail to Mexico to return Santa Anna to the Mexican nation. And just about the time the Invincible was preparing to shove off, a bunch of Army officers and new recruits from the United States recently arriving in Texas literally forced the prisoners off of the Invincible and back into confinement on land, because very, very much so, many Texans didn't want to see Santa Anna return to Mexico. Then soon word arrived that the Mexican Senate had annulled all of his agreements, Santa Anna's agreements that he had made with David G. Burnett in Houston on the battlefield of San Jacinto and afterwards. In fact, the Mexican government didn't believe that anything that Santa Anna had promised Texas was valid because of coercion. The Mexican government literally said no court in the world would recognize any decisions made and promises made by Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna while he was a captive of the Texans, because they the court would understand that if Santa Anna didn't grant Texans what they wanted, they would have killed him. So Santa Anna would have sold his mother into prostitution if that's what the Texans wanted on the battlefield of San Jacinto, but that didn't mean that would have been legal. And indeed, a counter-revolution in Mexico came to power, and this new government in Mexico basically said, you know what, not only do we disavow what Santa Anna has promised Texas, and Mexico still recognizes that she owns Texas, but we couldn't care less if the Texans kill Santa Anna, because he is not wanted in Mexico anymore since a counter-revolution has come into effect. And so eventually it was left to the first president of Texas, Sam Houston, to send Santa Anna not to Mexico but to the United States, and where Santa Anna promised Houston that he would meet with Jackson and do everything in his power to convince the American government to annex the independent Republic of Texas. As soon as Santa Anna got to Washington, Andrew Jackson had no use for Santa Anna and had the United States Navy immediately take Santa Anna back to Mexico. When he arrived in Mexico, the new Mexican government said, you got two choices, we'll shoot you or you can go into exile, and Santa Anna went into exile for several of his periods of exile as president of Mexico. But there was one last aspect of the Texas Revolution that we need to cover today, and that was that Texas, under Robert Potter, I believe Robert Potter was the Secretary of Navy, and Commander Hurd was the commander of the Texas Navy. Technically, the first battle of the Texas Revolution may be defined as occurring on September the 1st, 1835, when the Mexican schooner Correo, C-O-R-R-E-O, fought the San Felipe, which was bound for Victoria with munitions that for those who were marching on San Antonio with Ben Milam and Collingsworth. After 2 hours, the Correo was captured by the San Felipe. But on the 11th month, November 25th, 1835, the Texas Provisional Government authorized the purchase of 4 schooners for the Texas Navy. The Texas Navy took form beginning in January of 1836 with the purchase of these 4 vessels: the 60-ton Liberty, the 125-ton Independence, which was a former U.S. Customs ship, the 125-pound Invincible, built for the African slave trade, and the 125-ton 8-gun Brutus, fitted as a privateer originally in the United States. And William Hurd was appointed as the commander of the Texas Navy. The Brutus was lost in a storm in October of 1837. The Liberty captured the Mexican schooner Pelicano filled with supplies for the Mexican Army, and probably that was its most significant contribution to Texas. The Invincible took several prizes until in August of 1836 it ran aground and was destroyed in a battle with two Mexican ships. And in 1836 the Independence was captured in sight of Galveston after a 4-hour naval battle with Mexican naval ships. Texas ships primarily were used to keep the port of Galveston open, allowing supplies to flow from the United States to Texas. But that in turn meant that Mexico had uncontested use of several ports at the mouth of the Brazos and Campano Bay, which is Corpus Christi. And so it was that Major Isaac Burton and 30 armed men were used to patrol the Texas coast. These were the Horse Marines of the Texas Navy, and Isaac Burton and the Horse Marines managed to decoy the captain and the crew of 3 Mexican ships bearing supplies for Antonio Lopez's army. And it was critically important that these supplies were seized by Burton and turned over to the army of Sam Houston before San Jacinto. So the Texas Navy really did play a key role, in the independence of Texas. And so it is that we have reached the first testing period, and I will continue as time goes on to tape and try to get ahead. And for those of you who are doing your student teaching, I wish you the best of luck doing student teaching. I know that you're busy. I hope that you will be able to listen to these tapes, and I trust that I will not fall behind, since I was a full 3 weeks it was a full 3 weeks into the semester before I started taping. I hope that in tests to come that I will be able to stay ahead of the game, so to speak, and you can be able to take the tests at the regular time period. So study well, and hey, I'll see you in the clouds. All right, bye.